November 1943. A Marine sentry hears 3 perfect bird calls in the midnight jungle. 10 seconds later, 3 more. His finger tightens on the trigger not because something is there, but because nature itself has just lied to him. What he hears next will change Pacific warfare forever. Corporal Jack Mitchell had been awake for 37 hours when the birds started calling. That's what he would tell the debriefing officer 3 days later, though he wasn't sure anymore if those hours had blurred into days, or if the jungle had simply erased time altogether. The darkness around his foxhole on Guadalcanal was absolute, the kind of black that pressed against your eyeballs and made you question whether you'd gone blind. Every Marine who'd spent more than a week in the Solomons knew this darkness, and every Marine learned to hate it. The temperature was 86 degrees at 3 in the morning, humidity clinging to everything like a second skin. Mitchell's uniform had rotted 2 weeks prior, replaced by a spare that was already developing the same green mold around the collar. He'd stopped noticing the smell of decomposition, both from the jungle floor and from the hastily buried dead that the rains kept uncovering. What he hadn't stopped noticing were the sounds. The jungle was never silent. Insects created a wall of noise so constant it became a kind of silence itself, your brain filtering it out until something changed. Fruit bats screeched overhead. Tree frogs called to each other in irregular bursts. Somewhere distant, a cassowary made its low, booming call, a sound that vibrated in your chest cavity. Mitchell had learned these sounds the way you learn the breathing of someone sleeping next to you, intimate and unconscious. So when the bird called, he noticed immediately. 3 notes, evenly spaced, clear and distinct despite the insect chorus. A pause. Then 3 more notes, identical in tone, identical in spacing, identical in volume. Mitchell's hand found his rifle before his conscious mind caught up to what was wrong. He'd heard nightbirds before, plenty of them, but they didn't sound like that, they didn't count. He waited, breath shallow, eyes useless in the dark. 30 seconds passed. Then the call came again, from a slightly different direction. 3 notes pause, 3 notes mathematical precision. Something in Mitchell's gut twisted. He'd been in the Pacific Theater for 7 months, long enough to develop the instinct that separated the survivors from the body bags, long enough to know that perfection in the jungle meant danger. 2 foxholes to his left, Private Eddie Kowalski was probably hearing the same thing. 3 holes to his right, Sergeant William Chen definitely was, because Chen heard everything. They'd lost 11 men in the past 2 weeks to night infiltrations, and nobody knew how the Japanese were coordinating their attacks. No radio signals had been intercepted. No voices had been heard. The sentries would be alert, weapons ready, and then suddenly there would be shapes moving in the darkness, knives finding throats, grenades rolling into command posts. The bird called again, and this time Mitchell heard what his brain had been trying to tell him since the first call. The spacing was exactly 10 seconds. He'd been counting without realizing it. 3 calls, 10-second pause, 3 calls, 10-second pause, 3 calls. Nature didn't own a stopwatch. He clicked his tongue twice, the signal for alert, and heard it pass down the line. In the foxhole behind him, someone charged a bolt, the metallic sound absurdly loud. The fake bird went silent. The jungle insects continued their symphony, indifferent. Mitchell stayed frozen for another hour, rifle aimed at nothing, waiting for an attack that never came. When dawn finally broke through the canopy and shafts of gray light, he saw exactly what he expected. Nothing. No bodies. No spent brass. No evidence that anything had happened at all. But something had happened. The Japanese had made a mistake, and that mistake was about to unravel one of the most sophisticated infiltration systems ever deployed in jungle warfare. The Pacific War had become a war of invisibility. While Europe saw massive tank formations and artillery barrages that could be spotted from miles away, the island campaigns turned into something more intimate and terrifying. The jungle reduced visibility to yards, sometimes feet. Technology meant less than it ever had in modern warfare. Radar couldn't penetrate the canopy. Artillery was often useless when you couldn't see what you were shelling. Aircraft couldn't spot troops under triple canopy rainforest, so both sides adapted, and the Japanese adapted faster. The Imperial Japanese Army had developed infiltration tactics into an art form years before the Pacific War began. Their military philosophy, refined during campaigns in China and Manchuria, emphasized small unit operations, night movements, and the psychological destruction of enemy morale. They called their elite infiltrators Yuban Senshi, ghost warriors, and they trained them with a brutality that Western armies found incomprehensible. Japanese sniper and scout training was a months-long crucible that killed or broke roughly a third of the candidates. They learned to move through jungle undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf. They practiced remaining motionless for hours, while insects crawled over their faces. They memorized the sounds of dozens of animals and learned to replicate them with their voices or simple instruments carved from bamboo. But the real innovation came from a problem that plagued all military operations: communication. Radio communication in the jungle was unreliable at best. The terrain disrupted signals. The humidity destroyed equipment. More importantly, the Americans had gotten very good at radio direction finding. A single transmission could bring artillery down on your position within minutes. The Japanese learned this the hard way on Guadalcanal, when an entire battalion command post was obliterated because someone had transmitted a casualty report that lasted 15 seconds too long. They needed a communication system that couldn't be intercepted, couldn't be jammed, and didn't require line of sight. The solution came from an unexpected source: a young lieutenant named Hiroshi Takeda, who had grown up in Hokkaido and spent his childhood hunting in the forests. Takeda proposed using animal calls as a tactical communication system. The idea wasn't new. Indigenous peoples had used similar techniques for centuries, and even some Western military units had experimented with bird calls for signaling. But Takeda systematized it, creating an entire vocabulary of sounds that could coordinate complex operations. Different calls meant different things. 3 short bird whistles meant advance. 2 longer calls meant hold position. A single rising note meant enemy spotted. The call of a jungle fowl indicated the attack would come from the left flank. A fruit dove's coo meant artillery support was needed. More complex messages could be conveyed through combinations and repetitions. The system was brilliant because it was invisible. Even if Americans heard the calls, they had no way to distinguish them from the natural soundscape. The jungle was full of birds and insects and frogs, all calling constantly. Adding a few more calls to the cacophony should have been undetectable, and for months it worked perfectly. American casualties from night infiltrations spiked throughout late 1942 and early 1943. Entire squads would be found dead at dawn with no indication of how the attackers had coordinated their assault. Sentries reported hearing nothing unusual before the attacks. Guard rotations were increased. Perimeter defenses were doubled. Nothing helped. The Japanese seemed to have developed a supernatural ability to move through American lines and strike with precision. Units that should have been separated by hundreds of yards would attack in perfect synchronization. Snipers would cover each other's movements with uncanny timing. Withdrawal operations happened so smoothly it seemed choreographed. Marine Corps intelligence officers were baffled. They'd captured Japanese soldiers and interrogated them extensively, but nobody broke. The Japanese military code of honor, Bushido, meant that capture was so shameful that most soldiers chose suicide over surrender. The few who did surrender often provided false information or remained completely silent. Some American commanders theorized the Japanese had developed a new kind of short-range radio that couldn't be detected. Others thought they were using underground runners, soldiers who moved beneath the jungle floor through tunnels and natural cavities. A few suggested, only half-joking, that the Japanese had trained psychics. The truth was hiding in plain hearing. Sergeant William Chen was the first to put it together, though he'd never get official credit for it. Chen was 34 years old, ancient by infantry standards, and had grown up on a farm in central California where hunting supplemented the family income. He knew the sounds of nature the way a musician knows scales. On the night Mitchell heard the counting birds, Chen heard them too. But Chen had been hearing variations of these calls for weeks, and his hunter's brain had been cataloging inconsistencies. The next morning, Chen approached his platoon lieutenant with an observation that sounded insane. The birds were wrong. Not threatening, not unusual, just wrong. The lieutenant, exhausted and desperate for any lead, asked Chen to explain. Chen laid it out methodically. Over the past month, he'd noticed patterns in the jungle sounds that preceded attacks, certain bird calls that happened too regularly, Night sounds from diurnal species that should have been sleeping. Calls that came from positions too close to the ground for tree-dwelling birds. Most significantly, timing patterns that were too perfect. The lieutenant was skeptical until Chen played his trump card. 3 nights earlier, he'd heard what he identified as a common coal, a bird species known for its distinctive ascending call. The problem was that common coals didn't live anywhere near the Solomon Islands. Their range ended 1,000 miles to the west. Someone had learned to imitate a bird they knew from home and hadn't realized it didn't exist in the combat zone. That was the crack in the facade. Once you started looking for inconsistencies, they were everywhere. Within a week, every Marine unit on Guadalcanal had received new instructions for sentry duty. Listen for patterns. Listen for perfection. Listen for anything that sounds too deliberate. Most importantly, listen for calls that repeat with mechanical regularity. The results were immediate and dramatic. Sentries began reporting suspicious bird calls nightly. Officers started mapping where the calls originated, and within days, a picture emerged that made tactical sense. The calls weren't random. They formed geometric patterns that corresponded to military formations. 3 calls in a triangle pattern indicated encirclement positions. Linear calls suggested flanking movements. Calls that started distant and moved closer tracked advancing units. The Japanese were literally announcing their attack plans, and they didn't know anyone was listening. On November 18, 1943, a Marine platoon defending a supply dump on Bougainville put the new knowledge to lethal use. At 2300 hours, sentries detected a pattern of bird calls forming a semicircle around the northern perimeter. The calls were identified as willy wagtails, small birds that were indeed native to the region, but were exclusively diurnal and never vocalized at night. Instead of waiting for the attack, the platoon commander repositioned 2 machine gun teams to cover the predicted infiltration routes. He ordered complete silence and darkness. Then they waited. At 0230, the bird calls changed rhythm, shortening to rapid bursts. Attack signal. But the Japanese didn't know they were advancing into pre-sighted kill zones. When they emerged from the tree line, low crawling toward what they thought were unsuspecting positions, the machine guns opened up with intersecting fields of fire. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes. 17 Japanese soldiers were killed before they could react. Not a single American casualty. The Japanese unit had been a specialized infiltration team, each member carrying suppressed weapons, grenades, and bamboo instruments carved to produce specific bird calls. Intelligence officers examining the bodies found small notebooks with codes, matching specific calls to tactical commands. It was proof of a sophisticated system that had just become completely compromised. But the Americans didn't stop at defensive application. They turned the Japanese system against itself. The counter-operation began simply. Marines with musical ability were taught to replicate the bird calls they'd been hearing. The imitations didn't need to be perfect, because the Japanese versions weren't perfect either. They just needed to be consistent with the patterns already established. Then they started lying. On a rainy night in December, a Japanese assault team preparing to attack an ammunition depot heard their coordination calls being answered. 3 short whistles from their commander received 3 short whistles in response from the position where 2nd Squad should have been setting up. The problem was that 2nd Squad hadn't sent that signal. A Marine corporal with a harmonica had. The Japanese commander, thinking his units were in position, sent the attack signal. His squads advanced on the depot from multiple directions, believing they had coordination and surprise. What they had was confusion. Units arrived at different times because half the signals they'd received were false. Some squads held position waiting for confirmation calls that never came. Others advanced into crossfire because they thought friendly units were covering flanks that were actually empty. The battle became chaos, and chaos favored the defenders who knew the trick. By dawn, the Japanese assault had collapsed with catastrophic casualties. The psychological impact was worse than the tactical defeat. Japanese officers began to distrust their own communication system. Some units abandoned the bird call method entirely, returning to hand signals or whispered commands, both of which were less effective at coordinating complex night operations. Others kept using the system but with modifications, never realizing that American intelligence was now recording and cataloging every variation. The shift in Pacific jungle warfare didn't happen overnight, but it was decisive. American casualties from infiltration attacks dropped by more than 60% between late 1943 and mid-1944. Japanese after-action reports, captured later in the war, showed increasing frustration with what they called communication degradation and inexplicable coordination failures. They never fully understood what had gone wrong. Some Japanese commanders blamed poor training. Others suspected American radio intercepts that didn't exist. A few came close to the truth, noting in reports that American sentries seemed to have developed unnatural hearing abilities that allowed them to detect infiltration attempts. The real explanation was simpler and more fundamental. The Japanese had tried to impose military order on natural chaos, and nature didn't cooperate. Sound in the jungle environment operates according to complex rules shaped by temperature gradients, humidity, vegetation density, and countless other variables. Birds don't call at regular intervals because they're responding to environmental stimuli that are inherently irregular. A bird might call to defend territory, attract a mate, warn of predators, or simply because another bird called and it's responding. These interactions create acoustic patterns that are organic and unpredictable. Humans imitating these sounds bring human characteristics to the imitation. We think in beats and measures. We count without realizing it. We create patterns because our brains are pattern-making machines. A Japanese soldier trained to give 3 sharp whistles for advance would unconsciously space those whistles evenly, because even spacing feels correct to human cognition. But birds don't feel that spacing is correct. Birds interrupt themselves. They change tempo mid-call. They respond to stimuli humans can't detect. A shift in wind, a distant predator, another bird challenging them. Real bird calls are filled with imperfections that human imitations lack. The frequency analysis showed other problems. Human vocal cords and throat structures can't replicate the exact tones many birds produce. We can get close enough to fool a casual listener, but precise acoustic analysis reveals differences in harmonics and overtones. Some birds produce sounds using a completely different mechanism than mammalian vocal cords, creating frequencies and modulations that are physically impossible for humans to duplicate accurately. Then there was the volume issue. Birds project sound differently than humans because of their body size and physiology. A small bird producing a loud call does so with a different acoustic signature than a human trying to project the same call across a similar distance. The sound wave propagation is subtly different. The decay rate is different. The way it interacts with obstacles is different. These weren't differences the Japanese soldiers could correct with training. They were fundamental limitations of trying to fake a biological system you're not part of. American Marines were detecting these differences unconsciously at first, the same way you might notice something is off about a photograph, without immediately identifying that the shadows are wrong. But once intelligence officers started training sentries specifically in what to listen for, the detection rate skyrocketed. Field guides were distributed showing visual representations of sound patterns. Real bird calls have irregular waveforms with lots of variation. Human imitations show more regular, repetitive waveforms. Sentries were taught to listen for that regularity, that too-perfect quality that marked human origin. By mid-1944, the acoustic battlefield had shifted entirely. Japanese infiltration tactics that had been devastatingly effective in 1942 were now predictable and dangerous for the attackers. Units that had once terrorized American positions were suffering 70% and 80% casualties on operations that should have been routine. The human cost on both sides was staggering, though the numbers were never fully calculated. For every Japanese soldier killed because his bird call was too perfect, there was a story. Many were teenagers, conscripted from farms and villages, given a few months of brutal training, and sent into a jungle that killed with disease as efficiently as bullets. They followed orders, used the techniques they'd been taught, and died without understanding why those techniques had stopped working. Corporal Yasuo Tanaka survived the war, and years later gave an interview to a Japanese military historian. Tanaka had been part of an infiltration unit on New Britain in 1944. He described the bewilderment his unit felt when their carefully planned night attacks began falling apart. They would coordinate using the bird call system they'd drilled 1,000 times, advance with perfect timing, and somehow the Americans would be waiting in exactly the right positions with exactly the right weapons. Tanaka's unit lost 41 men out of 53 over a 6-week period. He was pulled from combat after being wounded and later assigned to training duties in Japan. He spent the rest of the war teaching new infiltrators the bird call system that he knew, on some level, no longer worked. But orders were orders, and questioning orders was unthinkable in the Imperial Army. The American side had its own stories. Private Eddie Kowalski, who'd been in the foxhole near Mitchell that night on Guadalcanal, survived the entire Pacific campaign and returned to Detroit after the war. He rarely talked about his service, but his grandson recorded an interview with him in 1998, 2 months before Kowalski died. In the interview, Kowalski describes the strange nature of acoustic warfare. He talks about lying in darkness, trying to determine whether the sound he just heard was a bird or a death sentence. He describes the paranoia that developed, the way every natural sound became suspect. Even decades later, he said he couldn't hear certain bird calls without his pulse quickening, but he also describes the satisfaction when the tables turned. The night his unit ambushed a Japanese infiltration team based on bird call detection, Kowalski said he felt something shift in the campaign. For months they'd been prey, hunted by an invisible enemy. Suddenly, they were hunters, using the enemy's own tools against them. Sergeant Chen, the man who first identified the pattern, was killed in action on Peleliu in September 1944. He never knew how many lives his observation had saved. His service record notes he was recommended for a Bronze Star for exceptional tactical awareness, but the citation was downgraded to a commendation because his commanding officer didn't think listening to birds qualified as valor. By the time someone higher up the chain realized the significance, Chen was already dead. The tactical evolution continued beyond the immediate bird call problem. American forces began developing their own acoustic deception techniques. Recordings of jungle sounds were played at irregular volumes and timings to mask the sounds of actual troop movements. Some units experimented with animal calls of their own, though they were more successful using mechanical devices than vocal imitation. The lesson, hammered home in after-action reports and training manuals, was that nature couldn't be faked convincingly by humans. Any attempt to disguise military communication as natural sound would eventually be detected because human psychology and biology imposed patterns that didn't exist in nature. This principle extended beyond bird calls. Units tried using insect sounds, mammal calls, even the sounds of wind and rain. All failed for the same fundamental reason. Humans make patterns, nature makes chaos. Post-war analysis by military acoustics researchers confirmed what the combat troops had learned through experience. Natural soundscapes have a measurable quality called acoustic complexity that human imitations can't replicate. This complexity comes from the layering of multiple sound sources, each with its own irregular timing and frequency modulation, creating an acoustic texture that is recognizably natural. Human-generated sounds, even very sophisticated imitations, lack this complexity. They're too clean, too regular, too focused. The human brain, it turns out, is extremely good at detecting these differences, even when it can't consciously articulate what's wrong. Modern special forces operations absorb these lessons comprehensively. NATO training manuals from the 1960s onward include sections on acoustic camouflage that emphasize the impossibility of vocal imitation. Current doctrine states explicitly that any audible communication in hostile territory should assume it will be detected and identified as human in origin. The technology that eventually solved the communication problem was the development of extremely short-range, low-power radio systems that couldn't be detected beyond a few hundred meters. Combined with sophisticated encryption and burst transmission techniques, these systems allowed the kind of coordination that bird calls had attempted without the vulnerability to acoustic analysis. Some special forces units experimented with subvocal communication systems, devices that detected throat muscle movements associated with speech and transmitted them electronically. These allowed silent communication that was genuinely undetectable by normal hearing. But even these systems had limitations in jungle environments, where humidity and vegetation degraded electronic performance. The irony is that in some ways, modern military units are more vulnerable to acoustic detection than their World War II predecessors. Contemporary warfare relies so heavily on electronic communication that many soldiers have lost the fieldcraft skills that earlier generations developed. The ability to move silently, to read natural environments, to operate without constant radio communication. These skills atrophied as technology advanced. Some military historians argue that the lessons of Pacific acoustic warfare have been forgotten and will need to be relearned in future conflicts. Others point out that technology has advanced to the point where acoustic camouflage is less critical. Surveillance drones, thermal imaging, and satellite reconnaissance make silent infiltration nearly impossible anyway, so there's less tactical value in perfecting it. But the core lesson remains relevant beyond military application. The Japanese bird call failure illustrates a fundamental principle about human cognition and natural systems. We are pattern-making creatures trying to operate in a universe that doesn't follow our patterns. When we try to impose our order on natural chaos, the seams show. This principle applies to far more than warfare. Ecosystem management programs fail when they try to impose simplified patterns on complex natural systems. Agricultural practices that attempt to standardize growing conditions often create vulnerability to pests and diseases. Even artificial intelligence systems struggle to replicate the genuine randomness found in nature, tending instead toward pseudo-random patterns that can be detected and exploited. The Pacific War bird call story is ultimately about the limits of human imitation and the persistent distinctiveness of natural systems. It's about how our strengths, our ability to organize, systematize, and create order, become weaknesses when we're trying to blend into environments that operate on different principles. On that November night in 1943, when Corporal Jack Mitchell heard 3 bird calls that counted to 10 between repetitions, he was detecting something profound. He was hearing the difference between human and nature, between imposed order and organic chaos, between what we think sounds right and what actually is right. The Japanese soldiers making those calls were brave, well-trained, and following tactics that should have worked. They failed not because they were incompetent, but because they were trying to do something fundamentally impossible: make human behavior indistinguishable from natural behavior. Nature, it turns out, is a better liar than we are. It lies with complexity and chaos and infinite variation. Humans lie with patterns and regularity and unconscious rhythms. And in the darkness of a Pacific jungle, those patterns became signatures, marking the difference between those who belonged and those who were pretending. Mitchell survived the war. He returned to Michigan, married, had 3 children, and worked for 40 years at an automotive plant. He never talked much about his service, which was common for his generation. But his daughter remembers that he loved going to the state park near their house, and he would sit for hours just listening to the birds. She asked him once what he was listening for. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Making sure they're real," he said. She laughed, thinking it was a joke. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was completely serious. Somewhere in his memory, burned in by adrenaline and fear, was the knowledge that sounds could lie, that perfect timing meant danger, that nature in all its chaotic inconsistency was the only thing you could trust to be honest. The bird calls in the Michigan forest were gloriously random, overlapping and interrupting each other, speeding up and slowing down, full of imperfections in life. They didn't count to 3. They didn't pause for exactly 10 seconds. They were real in a way that the jungle sounds on Guadalcanal sometimes weren't. And for Mitchell, decades after the war, that distinction still mattered. The memory of those 2 perfect calls in the darkness remained sharp, a reminder of the night when nature's chaos saved his life, because it couldn't be faked. The jungle birds of the Solomon Islands still call to each other across the ravaged battlefields, where rusted helmets and corroded rifles disappear into the undergrowth. They call without rhythm or pattern, responding to stimuli humans can't detect, creating soundscapes of beautiful disorder. And somewhere in those calls is the ghost of a lesson learned in blood, that perfection is suspect, that order betrays, and that life's essential truth lies in its refusal to march to any rhythm but its own. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's hidden battles. Drop a like if you learned something new today, and let us know in the comments what other untold war stories you'd like us to cover. Your support keeps these stories alive.